Season 1 of House of the Dragon is almost as good, and if not just as good, as the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones. That's a very high commendation to pin onto the show, but I think it's leaning more towards the almost as good, since there was a couple aspects holding the season back from perfection. Firstly, let's go into the glaring positives and talk about the plot of the season. House of the Dragon is in a weird spot where the meat of the story is later on, and right now, they primarily have to do a ton of setup. Most shows given the same task would be pretty terrible since they'd be overly expository driven, and the plot wouldn't be engaging enough to enthrall the audience. But here in House of the Dragon, they somehow make the story riveting throughout every episode, despite the limitations of the story not being as grand or crazy as Game of Thrones. They do this by having a consistent presence of entertaining conflict that simultaneously explores the intricacies of every character. We don't just sit here and have someone tell us the histories of House Targaryen or House Hightower, and instead, we witness the rich characters work to overcome heaps of obstacles that simultaneously builds them into concrete characters with fully established traits and personalities. Even side characters like Rhaenys and Corlys are incredibly detailed in scenes in which we explore their complex motivations, like Corlys's quest for power and Rhaenys' love for her family are entrancing. This is essentially catalyzed by the debacle of wanting to get entangled in royal politics, so the conflict works for both interesting story progression and character progression. Each episode has a micro problem that needs to be solved, and that's something that a lot of shows forget. Normally most time and attention is spent on the macro problems, but here, the emphasis is put on the small conflicts that develop characters. For other shows, these minor obstacles generally act as filler, however that isn't the case here. Whether that's Rhaenyra overcoming the responsibilities of marriage, childbirth, loss, or love, the writers essentially send every character down an insane obstacle course of conflict that sets them up for the oncoming war. That on its own is pretty impressive from a writing standpoint, but what makes this even crazier to grasp is having so many scenes with an ensemble of main characters interacting with one another. This is something that David and Dan really dropped the ball on for how underdeveloped and awkward their group scenes were in the later seasons, but the writers in this show handle it very well. Whether that's the Last Supper, the funeral of Laena, the wedding dinner, or any small council scene, the attention to detail and thought that's put into every microscopic character beat floors me, and the characters get to shine brightly. The coverage always accounts for small character reactions that act as development for them that doesn't require dialogue. Like the entire post-funeral scene where every character is glaring at one another, and just from their expressions alone, you can easily tell their views of one another. The ensemble scenes are always a joy to watch, and it never feels like the writers are leaving out any important interactions. Like when you think about it in Game of Thrones Season 8, why did Arya never have a scene with Daenerys, given that she idolized the independent and badass nature of her ancestors? Or even character pairings that last less than a minute and needed much more time before cutting away. House of the Dragon never feels like they're missing out on development, and every character interaction moment is fully realized. We aren't getting thrown out of scenes jarringly, like Jon Snow being on the verge of telling his sisters his identity, and instead, we have a complete beginning, middle, and end for each scene. None of that bullshit lazy writing from Season 8 is here, and it's refreshing that the writers are competent at writing long and fully fleshed out dialogue scenes. Which on the subject of dialogue, it's pretty good here. Now, it isn't as outstanding as it is in Game of Thrones, given that it's pulled directly from George R. R. Martin, but I think the writers still did a great job in House of the Dragon. I'm honestly surprised and did not have high hopes for the dialogue going into the show, since the source material doesn't really have any to draw from, and they still managed to make some quotable lines that still stick with me after finishing the season.
I will not sit here and suffer crows that come to feast on their corpses! Not to be suffocated by all this fucking politicking!
What is this brief mortal life, if not the pursuit of legacy? History does not remember blood. It remembers names.
She can have her answer now, stuffed in her father's mouth along with his withered cock. Let's end this mama's farce.
So even though the dialogue isn't technically as good as Game of Thrones, that doesn't mean it's not great. Because Game of Thrones level dialogue is a very hard bar to clear on its own. Overall for the story, it was still able to be entertaining without relying on any major twists to throw the narrative into the stratosphere. Especially since each episode had some form of major confrontation going on that always kept the audience engaged with what was happening with every character. Because of this, no episode felt underwhelming and the show felt really consistent in terms of strength of the plot. Looking at the characters, I think we have an amazing roster here. To me, the standout is definitely Viserys Targaryen. The way his character balances wanting to keep things peaceful while not wanting to overly address conflict is an endearingly wholesome quality despite it not being a very good trait for a king. Since he's such a pure-hearted character, it's a tragedy that he meets such an agonizing and slow death. This transformation is so jaw-dropping, and the ability to visually track his decay throughout the season was a great idea from the writers. Paddy Considine seamlessly blends between these points of taking on increasingly more pain and taking on the burden of trying to hide it and appear stronger. I love the small details starting out where you can subtly see he's hurting on the inside, but he doesn't want to show it. That meticulously planned out acting of focusing on the intricacies is brilliant, and seeing it progress towards the later and more grievous stages of his death was outstanding. What I think is single-handedly the best moment in the show is Viserys smiling at the Last Supper and witnessing his family be happy for one last time. It makes me cry thinking that he died a happy man, and this was the last drop of pure joy he could witness in his sea of misery. Every scene with Viserys was great, and I'm rooting for Paddy Considine to get an Emmy win. The next standout character is definitely Daemon. It's kind of hard to describe the man. He's cunning, smart, suave, sexy, unpredictable, brave, and loves to get his hands dirty. He's kind of the likable wild card of the group, and because of that, it makes him so intriguing. Not to mention that Matt Smith is pretty goated, and it feels like he slips right into the character. Otto Hightower is just an absolute babe, and you can't dispute that. Rhys Ifan in his hypnotizing gravelly voice made every line he spoke so varied and detailed. I played a montage of him saying "Your Grace" in a prior review, so I feel like I should play that again here.
What must I say at your grace? Your grace. Your grace.
Your Grace.
I'm sorry, Your Grace. That's hardly how I viewed it, Your Grace. Well, you honor me, Your Grace. Your Grace.
The character in essence embodies what I love so much about this universe, which is the political manipulation that he channels really well. Episode 9, where he's ruling with an iron fist and making people change allegiances, was extremely chilling, and I can't wait to see more of that in the next season. For Rhaenyra, I'd say I liked the younger actress a bit more, and not saying that Emma D'Arcy was bad by any means, and she did a great job in showing a more mature version of Rhaenyra, but the emotional depths that Millie goes to for young Rhaenyra was astounding. Any scene in which she's exploring the hardships of growing up and dealing with that immense conflict of responsibility was engrossing. I love how she'll go through a journey in each episode and then arrives at a major confrontation that severely changes her as a character. And that's normally shared between her and Viserys, and their scenes together were so precious. Such a good actor, and I'm excited to see her career take off from here. For Alicent, I liked both actresses pretty equally. I think Emily Carey was a bit more reserved in terms of breaking and getting upset and holding everything in, which she did perfectly. Meanwhile, Olivia, on the other hand, was really good at unleashing those emotions and exploding. The scene within episode 7 where she rushes Rhaenyra with a blade was an amazing showcase for her, and she's just so goddamn expressive with her eyes. Then, I really like how they made Alicent have a strong moral conscience in comparison to Otto. It kinda gives you someone to root for on the green side of the coin and allows you to sympathize with them. Some people may prefer the more bold and evil villains like Joffrey and Ramsay, but having a villain who isn't entirely bad and is more self-serving is refreshing. That's why I think Tywin is the best villain in Game of Thrones, because he's a good guy at the center of his story, but he does terrible things. And the same can be said for the Hightowers. Technically what they are doing is wrong since they are defying Viserys' wishes, but it's realistic to try to seize the power for themselves. Along with the fact that having a male ruler is probably more supported by the common people. So I really enjoyed the Civil War style conflict in which you have characters on either side that you can agree with. Although the Blacks are much more portrayed as the good guys here. We'll see if that remains to be the case, since Rhaenyra will probably do some heinous things next season from how mad she was in the ending scene. One major aspect of House of the Dragon that is a significant step up above Game of Thrones is the increased production value. The cinematography, music, set pieces, locations, and VFX were all expertly done, and since they had such a high budget to pump up these production pillars, the show was able to flourish. The cinematography in particular was very different in comparison to Game of Thrones, and so much to the point that it was kind of jarring at first, because the first few seasons of GOT feel more grounded and naturalistic in their approach, while here, the lighting in particular feels more cinematic. So many scenes had stark contrasts that made them feel moodier and more dramatic, along with their overall color grade playing into that feeling. Also, I think there were more impressive shots, like anything within the stepstones was delicious. How they accentuated key character moments, more usage of shallow focus to bring out depth, and more dynamic shots like rack focusing between two different characters. Every scene is uplifted by this great cinematography and makes it feel like you're actually watching something that's expensive. For locations, initially, I thought they were going to overly rely on the volume to film scenes, but they actually went to some beautiful places. For example, locations for Dragonstone were basically filmed on a mountain. It was so hard to film there that they had to helicopter in equipment and set up tons of infrastructure. The result from all this work pays off because it fleshes out the world when you can realistically film in it instead of faking it in the volume. Not to say that the volume is bad, but overly relying on it can hurt the scale of your show. However, when they do use it, like the confrontation scenes outside of Dragonstone, it's seamless because it fits into the already large collection of real locations. That's a great way to make these fictional places feel real. Since the creators had a bigger budget, it just feels so liberating for them to fully spend it and not hold back on where they wanted to film. Like these large beaches during low tide in which the crew only had a small window of time to film was probably pretty expensive to shoot at, but it pays off because the footage they managed to capture was gorgeous. Then for the sets, they did not hold back at all, and they basically made the entirety of the fictional locations they sought to create. The Red Keep is just one big set with a bunch of connecting rooms, and Dragonstone is grandeur on top of having a much better atmosphere. The steam permeating from the ground and even the war table glowing up were such nice touches that weren't in Game of Thrones. It's also more logical to spare no expense on these sets because of how many scenes take place here. It allows the filmmakers to have a lot more versatility within these scenes when they're able to shoot in almost any direction. Like my favorite showcase was during the wonder of Rhaenyra walking with her baby to Queen Alicent, and they essentially walked through the entire set, showing off its pure scale. I truly wasn't disappointed by any set piece in the show, and even the VFX was outstanding. It's nice that HBO had a lot of practice doing dragons because they look fantastic in this show, primarily due to the fact that they have different and distinct designs and don't look like carbon copies of one another anymore. This also allows each of the dragons to show off a certain personality, like the scary and unsettling way Caraxes noodles around his neck, or Granny Vhagar slowly moving around given how massive she is. Which they also did a good job in communicating the scale of the dragons, like Aemond having to climb up Vhagar like she was a tower, or whenever they position a dragon near one of our main characters as a size comparison. They do not shy away from showing off their dragons, and that's also a refreshing aspect because you can fully see them in any night scene. Generally, when VFX is done at night, it's always intentionally done to hide the VFX, but during Vhagar's 2 flight scenes, you can clearly see what's going on. And since they don't hide anything, it makes for some insanely good scenes. Vhagar's last scene in the finale, because of this, was easily one of the best from how terrifying and scary it was. Truly a very immersive experience. Then that's just the visual side of things because Ramin Djawadi is back for the score. The man is still killing it, and the new themes he created for the Velaryons and Rhaenyra were so good. The chorus chants of Rhaenyra's theme immediately gives you this uplifted feeling that is so addictive to listen to. I also love how it all culminates in her ending scene, when she becomes queen in the track called The Crown of Jaehaerys. I definitely recommend checking it out along with The Power of Prophecy. Then the Valyrian theme sounds so unique with its tribal-like woodwinds playing with drums and violins accompanying it. It's so fresh and distinct that it makes me crave to see Ramin Djawadi flex and experiment more within Westeros. And since we are on the subject of themes, it's kind of disappointing that there wasn't a new main theme for House of the Dragon, and they instead used the one from Game of Thrones. It would make the most sense to me to combine the themes of Rhaenyra and House Targaryen for the title sequence, but oh well. I think this sets more of a lazy precedence for other spin-off shows that are in development, and hope they don't follow down the same path, because it would be weird to hear the same Game of Thrones theme in every single show, especially since the upcoming Sea Snakes show, as an example, already has such a cool theme. But yeah, since the budget for House of the Dragon is so big, the production value of this season is able to ascend, and the result is truly amazing. So after going through all of these scintillating positives, let's talk about some of the negatives that bring the show down a little bit. Starting with the pace at which the story moves. Not in the sense of how quickly each scene plays out, because if anything, the writers take their time on a scene-to-scene basis, but more of the fact of how fast time moves between episodes, aka time jumps. Now it's really hard to avoid this fact given that the writers have to cover about 20 to 30 years of time within 10 episodes. Personally, I think it would have made more sense to do a longer season so they didn't have to skip so much time and avoid that jarring feeling of having to restart the show again. I think Lancel needs to get the showrunners the season stretcher. Because the main issue with doing these time jumps is firstly, you are skipping over a lot of plot lines. My biggest gripe is getting thrown into these developments at the mid/end points, and we didn't get any build up for them. The worst examples of this is Sir Harwin Strong's relationship with Rhaenyra and Daemon's relationship with Laena Velaryon. Within episode 6, both Sir Harwin and Laena die, and you don't feel that sad for them because there was no time to build an emotional attachment to these characters. The whole point of build-up is to make us care about them and understand who they are. So when you don't include it and throw their death at us suddenly, then we're going to feel detached and the death has a soft impact. That, and it's also just confusing to see a character go from killing their wife to then being in a family with a bunch of kids in the next episode. So having to essentially re-meet these characters and have to be introduced to what is happening again shouldn't be the aim of the writers, and instead, naturally get to that point by taking more time to tell your story. Then there's also the aspect of how old the actors look. Now to me, I don't really care about this aspect that much, but it does become visually confusing when someone like Criston Cole doesn't age at all within the 20 plus years the show takes place, in comparison to other characters who age a lot. Like hell, the character Aemond gets born in between episodes 5 and 6, and he looks just as old and if not older than Criston Cole by episode 8. So to that degree, it feels a bit inconsistent in terms of how they age up the actors, but you kinda just have to accept that aspect of the show, because the only option they have is to constantly keep changing to older actors or use makeup, which using makeup I don't think would really work. So to change actors every 10 years within the show would be even more jarring than just having the same one to me. The fans were already losing their minds when they swapped out Millie and Emily for their older counterparts, so doing that more frequently I think would be much more annoying. So I think this just comes down to people having to accept that part of the show, since there isn't a better alternative to take. For the last flaw of the season, there are a couple of big changes the writers make within the story that I think needed to be rewritten or needed some time to breathe. The first example of this is Criston Cole snapping and killing Joffrey. The reason why this development doesn't work well is that they immediately do a massive time jump after it happens. So any big questions relating to this event are instantly disregarded and aren't addressed again. Like, will there be any repercussions for Criston Cole doing this? Does Alicent defend him from being kicked out of the Kingsguard? Does Criston lie about the event? And even if he does, wouldn't that further taint his honor that he cares about? And do any of the witnesses care to make a statement? It just doesn't make sense to hit the skip button right when we get to the peak of Criston's arc. There are so many aspects surrounding this major story development that need to be resolved, and the fact that the writers do a time jump over all of it is insane to me. This kind of ties back to the repercussions of doing time jumps, but I also think this was a sloppily written scene, because there are some contrivances within this scene, like the crowd randomly turning into a mosh pit for no reason, other than to forcibly instill a moment of confusion and chaos. Going into another big change they made that I feel like needed to be reworked, we have Rhaenys busting through the floor of Aegon's coronation and letting the Greens live. In the book, she wasn't even in King's Landing when this all went down, and the writers made this change to quote-unquote give Rhaenys a bigger moment to shine. Which firstly, that doesn't really track well because Rhaenys here is killing hundreds of bystanders, so this immediately deteriorates my view of her, since she probably could have taken another exit within the caves. Then secondly, you are basically asking the audience to get annoyed when a character has the option to eliminate the entire thread of the show but chooses not to. Now, I do agree with the character decision here for Rhaenys, however, I feel like the writers should have made her choice more ambiguous, by establishing an external conflict that forces Rhaenys out of the scene, like another dragon showing up from the pits, or archers being posted up about to shoot her. With these misfires of endings, it hurts an already good episode and makes them end with a whimper. In the grand scheme of things, this isn't a major seasonal issue, but it does impact 2 episodes. So yeah, going into House of the Dragon, I was not expecting the show to be this good. Given that Ryan Connell didn't have an impressive slate of past work, and the source material offered little to no dialogue to work off of. So the fact that they were able to make a season this great really blows me away. I'm immensely looking forward to season 2, and since this story will most likely be more consistently riveting than the season on a story basis, I'm very excited. Thank you for watching, and if you're at all curious as to what I think about other popular movies, then I've probably rated them on Letterboxd. I generally don't have enough time to make videos on everything I watch, so if you're curious, you can follow me on there and see what I'm watching currently. I haven't really put any attention on this, so yeah, the link will be in the description, and thank you in advance if you follow me on there.